Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. I'm your host, Brian Locascio, and today's guest is assistant professor in music therapy at Arizona State University. She received her master's and doctoral degree in music education, emphasis in music therapy, from the University of Kansas. Her interests include clinical work and research with young autistic children with autism and their families, parent coaching and music interventions, music therapy with survivors of domestic violence, music therapy student development, and music neuroscience. In 2004, she founded a music therapy agency in her home country, Mexico, where she provided clinical services and continuing education opportunities for professionals regarding music therapy, autism, and domestic violence. She has presented clinical research posters and presentations in regional, national, and international conferences. Her research has been published in the Journal of Music Therapy Perspectives, Nordic Journal of Music Therapy, Psychology of Music, and Review Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. She currently serves on the Continuing Education Committee of CBMT. She is also a part of the editorial board of Music Therapy Perspectives and a frequent guest reviewer of Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, Journal of Music Therapy, Psychology of Music, Nordic Journal of Music Therapy, Research in Autism Spectrum Disorder, and Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Hernandez Ruiz.
Thank you, Ryan. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show and to talk about something that you're passionate about today.
Absolutely.
So one of the biggest questions that I always ask, and I love to just learn about the background of the people that I have on the show. So what led you to music therapy?
That's a great question. So in Mexico, there was no music therapy when I was a student. Okay, so I studied music composition. At some point, I started working as a music teacher in the same little school that I did my undergrad. And we had children from different levels of ability, different abilities, different disabilities too. And I got interested because I saw through the music classes how much they would learn and grow. But that was it. I really didn't have anywhere to go with that until I had the opportunity to travel and live for a few months in France. And I learned about music therapy. And the problem is that my French was pathetic and I couldn't study really there. And they offered only a bachelor's degree and I already had a bachelor's. So I started looking and I found that there was a graduate equivalence in the US, came back to Mexico and started looking for funding to come to the US, got a scholarship and came to the US, to the University of Kansas to do my master's equivalency program. Went back to Mexico and started practicing.
Okay, yeah, wow. So I didn't even know that you'd gone to France. How did you find out about music therapy in France?
I found a pamphlet, a little flyer that talked about music therapy, and I just was floored because I had never heard about that term even. And I actually sat in front of the computer to, browse about music therapy. And I was crying. I looked like a complete mad woman there because I was so excited that something that I had cared about therapy for a long, long time. I had been part of an organization that worked with women against domestic violence. So I had been in therapy training, some type of therapy training for many years. I started very young. And so I was very interested in therapy. And then I had been doing music, right? Music composition. So it was like the putting together my two loves in life. And I was very excited. And that's when I found that there was actually something called music therapy and that there were graduate programs in the US that I could access. And it was very exciting.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing that you were already kind of prepping yourself without even knowing it throughout your life.
Yeah. You have no idea.
That always shows the power of a pamphlet.
Yeah, exactly.
I make those pamphlets, people.
You never know.
So, yeah. So you continue to get your education for your equivalency, and you again eventually proceed on to get your doctorate. And now, where are you with music therapy? What does it look like for you currently?
Well, currently I'm a professor, so mainly teaching. That's what I do, and doing research. So I do a lot of research. I love research and I'm passionate about it. And I also teaching and working with students and preparing the next generation. I did clinical work full-time for 10 years. That was also my passion. I loved it. I wouldn't have changed it, actually, but I got the opportunity of another scholarship to come back, fellowship, to come back and do my PhD. And I was like, okay, let's do it. Brought the whole family in, let's do this. I wasn't originally planning on staying to teach here, but, life takes you places, and then I stayed here. I've been teaching, this is my third year at ASU, Arizona State University. And I would love to do more clinical work, but time is limited. And I also have the limitation that I'm an international scholar still. I still don't have full access to working outside of the university. So that's why I'm a little bit constrained there. But I love doing clinical research. That's where I still keep my clinical skills up.
Yeah. And within your clinical research that you're doing, what is it surrounding, or what are the ways that you're innovative with your research and music therapy?
Well, that's tricky. Okay, let me clarify that I believe that we all learn from others. Entering research is entering a conversation. And we try to bring something new to the conversation and not repeat ourselves. But we always enter a conversation with other people are sharing ideas, right? And so in that sense, I learned from others. I was trained when I was a clinician. I was trained in the Early Start Denver model, which is not a music therapy model. But then I tried to adapt it to my sessions, the same principles, the same ideas. And then I was trained in the parent Early Start Denver model, which is a way of coaching parents to work with or to parent their children, their autistic children. So that was a big part of my influence. So when I'm doing my PhD, I'm looking for what am I going to do with my research, I realized this is what I love. This is what I've been doing for 10 years. Clinically, I was doing working in an autism clinic. I also worked in domestic violence, but for some reason, autism was at the forefront. So I decided that I would like to change the parent coaching model to parent coaching of music interventions, with the understanding that there's an added level of complexity using a music intervention as opposed to just a behavioral intervention, because not everybody is musical or not everybody expresses their musicality the same way. And that was the big challenge. But that's what I've been doing. I've been trying to adapt the same principles. And I found that it's quite possible, actually. Parents are musical, and they can use what they understand as musical to help their children and support their children in their communication. So it's doable.
And what a great way of showing how music therapy can use to teach others how to use music therapeutically.
Exactly.
It's not something we have to hold on to. Like, we can share it with the world. And that brings us to our topic for today, which is parent coaching in times of COVID-19. So I'm going to let you have the floor here and say what you would like to say for it.
Well, I just want to define a little bit what parent coaching is. I've been saying it, and I would like to define it because there are many people that may not understand the fine distinctions. Because in research, we want to make fine distinctions so that we can compare and contrast. This is not to say that one model is better than the others. You might have heard about family-centered therapy, which is one of my influences, for sure. I like that literature. I believe in that literature. I think parents and caregivers in general should be involved. But many of those models, the music therapist is still at the center of the session, in the sense that they are giving the session, providing the music, making the music, providing the intervention. What I propose is a different model where I'm the coach of the parent, and the parent is making the music. The parent is making the intervention. Why? Because I think it creates a different type of roles between us, and it allows the parent to be empowered to do this when I'm not there. I'm not saying it's better. As I said, I think we have a different function. Family-centered is an amazing type of therapy. It has a different function. It also works in the parent-child relationship. It also helps the parent to some degree. But with the parent coaching, you are empowering the parent to be, quote unquote, your co-therapist. You are not making them a co-therapist. You are actually giving them the resources to be a better parent. Sometimes I've also heard, oh, we are displacing music therapists. Not at all. Not at all. Parents don't want to be therapists. They want to be better parents. And I think that's what we're doing with this type of models. Because what happens in a session in parent coaching, You sit with a parent, they work with the child, you observe. You may teach some principles, you may teach some music, you may teach some ways of using music. And then the parent practices within the session. And you observe again, and you give immediate feedback. Oh, try this. Or maybe, why don't you do this? And then, why don't you think like this? And then you give very immediate feedback that the parent adjusts. And then you do reflection. So what did you observe? What can you do better? What do you think worked for you? From a very culturally respectful way, because every family has their music, every family has their relationships, and you come in kind of an outsider, but you are going to allow them to be who they are. I have parents who sing beautifully and are very, very good at singing in tune. And then I have parents who are not, right? And you can still work with them because you can still work with rhythm. You can still work with chanting, with movement, rhythmic movement, and it's still going to be very effective for the child to engage and understand communication. I teach a lot of observational skills. What is the child trying to share with you? Stop and observe. Okay, don't jump to conclusions. Don't hold him and move him around. Just let him be. Let's observe for a second what they are trying to say. So very respectful observational skills that allow the parent be better communicator and better observer. So that's an important distinction.
Yes, and it sounds to me like you're making a very clear point between this is the therapist's role then. You are kind of recentering the idea of what the role is. You're not taking it away.
Exactly. And there's still place for doing other types of therapies, for the music therapist to be directly engaged with the child. And there's space for doing parent-child dyads. There's space for all types of models. This is just one more. That in times of COVID, I think it's particularly important. Why? Well, one of the projects I started a few months ago when I was really worried about particularly Mexico. The lockdown in Mexico was tremendous. I mean, people were locked down for a lot longer than in the US. They were having more trouble doing it because there was no financial support whatsoever. And people were, up the walls, really in trouble. So at some point I was like, well, let's try do it online and see what happens. I think it's a good model to try because after all, I'm not going to be doing music with a child anyway. I'm going to be teaching the parent, and the parent is able to do this on the screen. I work with young children, younger than 5 years old, okay? So that means that they are going to struggle to watch the screen. I know there are strategies to do it, but it's more of a struggle. Whereas the parent is not going to have that problem most of the time. So that was a model that lent itself very, very nicely for an online format. And I tried it. And I've been trying it. And that's a research project I'm doing with very nice results so far. I don't have the data, like the complete data, and we haven't analyzed it, but I have found some very interesting things.
Yeah, wonderful. And especially with those kids, I actually work with pediatrics as well right now. And for those kids that are anywhere 1 to 5, that attention towards the screen is not happening, especially for the younger range. So what a great way for parents to also do like the tactile interventions as well. And I could definitely see the benefits of telehealth in that setting. And I'm wowed to hear that you're also like extending that reach to Mexico as well and continuing to give back as well.
Exactly. That was my idea. As I said, I was worried about what was happening there. There are less resources in therapy and music therapy in particular. So I was like, well, I could do this and it would be rather accessible for people. Of course, I had to go through all the IRB approval, all the permissions from the clinics and the people and all that. But it was absolutely doable.
How do you go about introducing the dynamic that you're talking about to parents, especially if they're not used to incorporating music within their dynamic with the child?
That's a great question. So I have several steps. The first one is there's some type of communication, either email or some of the clinics that I know the directors introduce the topic, or I don't know, they see a post on Facebook that has a little bit of the information, and that's the first contact. Then the informed consent obviously explains what the session is going to be like. And then I have one session with them where I explain, this is what we're going to do. You are going to be making music. You are the one, working with your child. I'll be sharing this and this and that. And I explain the whole process. Since this is not the first time I do it, I have like a better idea of how to do it now. And so I can explain to them, we are going to do a session where we're going to talk about a topic, and then we're going to practice it, and when we're going to discuss, maybe practice again if there's enough time, and we are going to meet every week, and then you're going to get to practice. I have some handouts for you to practice throughout the week, and you can always email me if you have questions, and blah, blah, blah. And I explain the whole process, and then they are very comfortable. Maybe many of them come to this project because they already are comfortable with music. I don't know, or at least with creative processes. But I think that they are quite open. I have found they are quite open to doing it. And they really took to it because they didn't have any option, right? They were not getting services. And so it was a good alternative and a family-friendly thing to do.
Have you seen that by having the parents engage in the musical side of interaction with their children, that it has affected the types of bonding that they've had, especially during COVID?
Yes. Oh, yes. Again, I don't have the results, so this might be very biased opinion. But what I've observed is children paying attention, children being much more engaged. What families have reported to me, because I do a 6-week program, and then we don't meet for 3 months, and then I do a follow-up video and a follow-up interview. And at that interview, what parents have been telling me is that they are more engaged, that children are spontaneously asking to play, that children are coming up to their parent and let's play, let's sing, that children are spontaneously singing. Because that's another thing. The type of music intervention that I'm using is either, pre-composed children music that parents know, or just invented in the moment kind of songs that they make up for a specific purpose. They tend to be quite repetitive, or quite simple, I should say, simple and repetitive, but are related to the play situation or the everyday life situation. So it's something that's happening in the real life. It's not something that, okay, you have to sit down and let's learn this song. That's not how it works. It's something that is going to be integral to what they are doing in the moment. So I teach parents to kind of improvise little songs, right? And so children are doing that spontaneously. They are starting to sing on their own and starting to learn language because of that, of course, and then asking parents to play in that way. So it's been super cute and super satisfactory, I have to say.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Just I'm imagining a bunch of little kids running around singing to their parents. It'd be interesting to see how that like dynamic changes as they get older, and like what the techniques the parents will, if they'll just use more complex music or if they'll shift to a different style of approaching the needs of their kids. With COVID, have you seen any trends as far as what the songs are typically about, or the goals that parents are needing to address more?
That's interesting. Well, the concerns, when I meet them for the first time and I talk to parents, what is your concern? The concern is many times, I don't want them to get behind in their socialization and in their language development because we are on our own, just he and I or she and I, and there's nothing to do. There are no other children, and I'm concerned about stunting their development. And so that has been, again, using these little songs. I don't think there's a specific topic, but using music in their everyday life has empowered the parents to say, okay, we can keep working on those skills. We don't have to stop. Development happens every day. And they feel like they have a tool that they can use. Which honestly, that's a lot of the Early Start Denver model. The Early Start Denver model, when you do the parent coaching, is not about the parents sitting in front of a table and doing therapy. That's not how it works. It's doing strategies in the everyday life. So that is taken from this principle of naturalistic teaching. So teaching in life, in the life that every person has, right? Because that's how children really learn in their life. And so that's the same principle that I'm trying to use. Is like, if you're going to use music, I don't want you to sit 30 minutes and do songs. I want you to use songs you're walking to the store. Let's create a song, how you jump to the store. You are taking a bath. Let's make a song of taking a bath. If you are eating, let's create a song that teaches how to use the fork, or I don't know what. If you are playing with toys, let's create little songs that accompany our actions and our movements, so that we use labels and we develop language, but we also develop the social, affectionate perspective or bonding that has to go with play. And it happens. I see it.
Yes, and I know that because of COVID, a lot of families have adjusted, especially who's home and who's away. Especially like in the U.S., I pulled from the U.S. Census, and 1 in 5 of working age adults said the reason they were working from home was because COVID-19 disrupted their childcare arrangements. Have you seen similar trends in Mexico as the U.S. is showing within their census?
Oh, yes. I mean, I don't know the numbers, but I know for sure that the lockdown was total. And so people were not having access to any services for several months, and no schools. I think they just opened, or they are about to open these days. So it took forever. And for special ed services, there was nothing, like zero, none. And so clinics, autism services are mostly given through nonprofit organizations or private practices and all that. The state has some, but it's very, very limited. And so those were closed. So people were getting no services. It was very, very disruptive to their life. That's part of the motivation to do this. Yes, it was a big deal.
Yeah, within your research, so since you're mentioning individuals on the spectrum, have you mainly targeted those individuals, or quote unquote typically developing children as well?
No, it's all autistic children, because the Early Start Denver model is a model for working with children in the spectrum. So all my work has been geared towards that. I guess you can do parent coaching with any child, and those principles would transfer, but there's some peculiarities about this model that is, for example, the concreteness in your language, having short phrases, using simple toys that you are going to use at the level of development that the child is, that kind of thing that is adjusted for the characteristics of the child in the spectrum. But the fact that it's naturalistic, that fact that it has to be affectionate, the fact that the parent has to be responsive and sensitive to the child's needs, I guess that applies to any family, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Those transfers can definitely be made with any type of approach, I suppose, between different populations. So like, let's say there's an individual who is leading their own practice and they're wanting to expand those services to individuals in different countries. In this case, let's say Mexico. What are some like cultural considerations that they should have, especially like during COVID, before going about serving those with autism or autistic people?
Right. Well, I would say you need to be very flexible, because things are happening very fast. Changes are happening very fast. You cannot get upset if someone changes the schedule or has to, they are feeling sick or someone gets sick. You just have to adjust and be flexible. This is one of the most flexible studies I've ever done, because I just had to adjust. But that's clinical work. You have to adjust to the reality of the family. You also have to be very aware of certain principles. In my work, in my research, adapting the model, some of these are from the parent Early Start Denver model, and some I have taken from other sources. For example, I have read Dr. Locaccio's work, and she does beautiful work on rhythm and its impact on social communication and language, not only motor skills. I have learned from that. Dr. Lindsay and Dickens have also very good work on that. Trina and Chirelli are two people who have done work in Canada. Rhythm and music, they have worked with typically developing children, and some, I think, with autism, or autistic children. But the idea is that these pro-social behaviors are enhanced when music is present, mainly because of rhythm. So I've learned from all that. Those are principles that I think we should always remember. You want music to be the center of the intervention. You want to create the rhythm that is going to be accessible for both the parent and the child. In this case, because they are very young children, it has to be simple. And it's okay that it's simple musically. It's what the child needs. The lyrics have to be accessible. You want to respect family preferences, musical culture. But you can also play around with tempo, dynamics, gestures, scaffolding, all those principles that we know in music therapy. Other things that I have also learned in this with this work is that you want to incorporate adult learning principles because you're working with adults. That's one reason I think that to be able to work in this parent coaching model, you do have to have some previous experience as a clinician. Because if you want to tell the parent how to do it, probably you want to have done it yourself, right?
That's a really good point.
Otherwise, how do you tell them what to do? So you have to have first-hand experience with the children and working with the children and all that. Because you want to treat the parent as an adult. They are an adult. And they are an expert in their way of, they are an expert in their family. They know what they want for their family, for their child. There has been some important and interesting comments about not centering the parent. And I want to say this outright. I agree. We have to listen to autistic people. We have to listen to autistic adults. But we also have to understand that children don't grow up in a vacuum. They grew up in a system, in a family system, obviously in a school system and other systems, right? But their first and foremost system is the family. And the adults are the ones responsible there, whether we like it or not. The parents are going to be the one making the choices and making the decisions and blah, blah, blah. Of course, we have to be informed what autistic adults say and what has been useful, but we also have to respect the system because you cannot just come in and destroy the system. It's not going to help anybody. If you have systemic thinking, you have to understand and respect that. I have some training on systemic therapy, and I know that you have to intervene in such a way that you support and not destroy the system. Anyway, so the parent is the adult. The parent is making the choices. You want to work with him as an adult, like yourself. We know from adult learning principles that adults learn better if the material is relevant to their immediate needs, if they have hands-on practice and reflection, and if they are considered as experts in their own situation. I have very good experiences with families who are very humble and willing to learn, but I also make sure that I respect them and I give them their place. And what do you want? What do you think is the best? What do you think would work in this situation? How can you make it better? That's coaching. I'm not teaching, I'm coaching. They have a lot of resources already. And that's important to remember.
Yeah, thank you for outlining those adult concepts of teaching as well, because I don't think that's something that is, at least from my experience, talked about that much within the music therapy community. Maybe it is, and maybe I'm just out of the loop, but from my experience, those educational principles are not something that are addressed as much.
Right, and we need them. Also, that we are always going to be in this interplay where, yes, I have things to offer. Otherwise, why do it, right? I am the music therapist that has knowledge of how to gain the child's attention, how to sustain the interaction, how to create music, how to engage the child in nonverbal communication. I have that. That's what I do. But that's what I'm going to share. Another thing that we want to make sure that we do is that we understand what is the most critical ingredient of the intervention that I'm trying to teach the parent. And let's focus on that. Instead of trying to teach the whole thing and with all the whistles and, that we can do, what can the parent do in a very simple way and still be effective? And that takes some thinking. honestly. Sometimes I'm just sitting there thinking, what do I tell them? This is not working, but what is it that is not working? And then being able to say just one little thing that completely switches the interaction.
I can imagine, too, with the way that music therapy is integrated with children and adults, covering more than, for oftentimes one intervention can cover multiple things that you want to accomplish. So I can also imagine that when targeting those specific objectives that you want to address, you have to really, like you're saying, really focus in on what's the one thing to take away and then go ahead and scaffold and build from there.
Exactly. You don't want to overwhelm the parent. You don't want to make them feel that they are completely incompetent. That's not the feeling they have to leave with. They have to go out and say, oh, okay, I can do this. I can practice this. That's why I create 6 sessions where we build on the previous learning.
For those clinicians who may be new in the therapeutic context, what are some things that they should keep in mind when thinking about the differences between coaching and teaching somebody to be like a music therapist? Like, where do they draw that line, or what's some things that they should have in mind?
Yes. As I said, if I were a new clinician, I would be like, I don't know how to talk to a parent. I would be a little bit scared, with good reason. As I said, I think you have to have the direct experience before you teach other people to do it. One different model, and I have to plug someone else here, Todd Schwartzberg has been doing, he's a professor he's the clinical director of the University of Minnesota. So he's been doing very interesting work supervising students to incorporate parents in the session. Not as parent coaching, although they are supporting or helping the parent be kind of an assistant within the session. But they are still providing the direct services to the client with the help of the parent in the room, right? That's another model, and that's another way of doing it, which I think a clinician can do anytime. If you are still going to do the direct work, but you might need someone, a caregiver to support you in redirecting the client, in maybe providing instruments or providing materials. That's a very good way of doing it. And he's having a lot of success with that. So I would go and talk to him, go and talk to Todd Schwartzberg at the University of Minnesota. He's doing great work in that sense. Again, a different type of work, a different way of doing this.
There are so many different approaches and all proving to show their benefits. What is something that you considered when deciding which one you would decide to research, and what brought you essentially to favor one over the other?
Oh, that's a great question. So my motivation to do parent coaching in music therapy was the following. I was working in an autism clinic full-time, and I loved my work, and I thought we were doing a lot of great things, myself and other clinicians, psychologists, educators, whatnot. But I was concerned that once the child left, it was like nothing happened at home. This was a few years ago, okay? So it was like, okay, so how do we generalize? We know that generalization is very important, but how is that going to happen if parents have no resources to do that? Parents themselves would come and say, what do I do at home? What music can I play for him? Typical question, right? And I was like, no, it's not about the music. It's how you use it. Well, of course it's the music, but it's also how you use it and how you use yourself, how you interact with the child. And that frustrated me a lot. At some point, I was so frustrated because it was like, okay, I'm doing good, but I'm not doing enough if I cannot help the whole family. Again, I had this systemic perspective on family and helping the whole family. And sometimes they were very, very stressed, I have to say. They wanted to do better. They had no clue. That's when I got the training on Early Start Denver model, which opened the door, was like, wow, okay, we can take this home to the parents. And then the parent coaching. And it was like, this is it. I can help the parents by empowering them, helping them get some skills. I'm still, again, in total support of other models, but this one for me was something that was my need, helping the families as a whole and helping the parents be empowered when I wasn't there, when none of us were there. And so I started doing all my research around that, and that's been line. And it took me a while to get to this concept, I have to say. I tried a couple of things, and my first project, for example, was still a group session, where I was the center. I was still providing the music and everybody was in a different place. And it was so interesting. And I was like, no, this has to be an individual process, at least for the family, because every family is in a different place. So although I see the value in group sessions and how they share together, and they did, and it was awesome, and they become support groups and all that, again, that's a different function. If I want to work on the skills of this parent in particular, I have to do individual sessions with them. So it's been a process, and I keep learning. I'm still learning. I'm still growing the model and learning new things and that kind of thing.
Well, this definitely gets me excited, and I can imagine our listeners as well, as to the different things that they have to learn and these new ideas and approaches. It sounds to me, from what you're saying, that the approach also has to be intertwined with the therapist. Like, the person facilitating has to obviously have quite a bit of resonance with that approach as well, and depending on which one might favor to the clients as well.
Absolutely. That's one thing I would like to say. I don't think parent coaching is for everybody. I don't think every family is ready or wants to do this kind of projects. I've had attrition, for example, one of my studies, one family just didn't want it. And part of it is where the family was. They had a lot of stressors going on. Mom was not convinced that her child needed therapy. So they were not ready. So giving her the burden, it became a burden for her to do the work, just wasn't going to happen. So it was totally fine when she said, I'm not ready. I don't think this is for me. I was like, okay, fine. But I learned, it was like, okay, this is not for everybody. And if you read the literature, that's what they say. Parent coaching is not for everybody. As I said, parents have to be in a certain place and willingness to be able to do the work, because there is some work. Now, as a therapist, you also want to be very careful to not overburden them, because it can go there very quickly. And that's not the goal. Parents are busy. They have their jobs. They have their other children. They have many things going on. So it has to become something that is very organic to the family, not something that is another chore.
Well, I'm excited to ask you more questions about parent coaching in times of COVID-19, and to have our guests learn more from you as we return from this commercial break. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. I'm your host, Brian Locascio, and we are currently talking with Dr. Hernandez Ruiz on her research behind music therapy and parent coaching in times of COVID-19. Now, I wanted to continue asking you a little bit about the structure and theory behind this parent coaching that you've gone into. So if you would like to talk on that, what are some additional thoughts that you'd like to add?
Sure. I want to clarify some common misunderstandings about the work, especially when I mentioned early start Denver model. It's very interesting because, as I think we have already shared, things keep evolving. When this model came out about 11 years ago, they used the word ABA-based, so applied behavior analysis. It wasn't the only thing they used, and it's not only based on that, but they talked about it. Somehow it got dumped into the same bucket as pure ABA. They have evolved, because we all do as we learn more and we progress. And now they are actually not using that language. They are even contrasting their work against ABA, trying to see what the differences are, because there are some very important differences. Although the early start Denver model does use some behavioral and learning principles, it is also based on neuroscience findings, because they have done some neuroscientific studies on that. And most importantly, in developmental psychology. So understanding how development happens and how development can be different in children with autism. They have also incorporated new language, new understandings, like, for example, autistic children, although some of the literature doesn't necessarily reflect that. Again, we are all moving and changing. and growing and listening to autistic people. But some of the older literature may sound different to people. What I personally like about the model is that from the get-go, it was always a very comprehensive perspective of the child. It was not a one skill that we're going to develop. It was a very accepting perspective of the children. And it was also a very respectful perspective of the family as a whole. There was respect to the child as someone who might just need to develop some skills. And always this understanding that it was bringing the child into the social circle. So the understanding that there might be some missing building blocks of the social communication. Maybe children were missing some joint attention. They were missing some cues, some clues within the interaction. So by teaching them in a very respectful way, we can actually help them develop skills for social communication and develop shared experience and develop social and symbolic play and eventually develop language. It is not mandatory, by the way, that they develop language. It's more that if they can, let's try doing that. So the perspective is then that development is an interpersonal process. And that the quality, not only the fact that there is, but the quality of relationships mediate development. What I was saying before. So the relationship quality depends on how positive affect is being shared in the relationship, that there's reciprocity, that there's adult sensitivity and responsiveness. It's really important that the adult learns to be responsive to the child, that they learn to be understanding and accepting of the child. It's part of what we do. We don't want over-directiveness. We want adults to become play partners. And this is an early start of a model. So it's early intervention. We are working with that bonding and the attachment that happens between parent and child in very early stages. We think that parents are essential because parents are the first figure in the child's life, of course. So we want them to be involved. And this is going to happen, as I said before, within naturalistic teaching, in everyday life. Family then is central to therapy, not because the parent needs are centered, but because they are the system in which the child is going to develop. Then bringing this to music is, I found other theories outside of the early start Denver model that showed that, for example, I don't know if you know this is quite fascinating, that children typically all children have listened to behavioral cues to bond with their caregiver, right? So they respond to the smiles, they respond to the gaze, but it doesn't happen only at the behavioral level. It also happens at the psychophysiological level. Some research has shown that when parent and children can bond or are bonding well, it actually, their heart rate synchronizes, their breathing synchronizes. All those cues are actually synchronizing. It's fascinating. And when that doesn't happen, the communication is broken. So it's not only behavioral, it's also psychophysiological. But that's a point of intervention for us as music therapists, because we know that music has the ability to synchronize those cues, right? Music has a psychophysiological effect, not only an emotional effect. It has a psychophysiological effect. So that was fascinating to me because it was like, yes, we can use music to help parents and children find this point of interaction. And I'm not the only one who's saying that, by the way. As I was saying, Dr. Locascio is saying this in her writing, that music and rhythm can support this synchronization. Other people like Dr. Lancey and Dickens, Trainer and Tirelli, they are all finding through behavioral research that, yes, when you create rhythm in the dyad, they start synchronizing their communication, among other things, because music can increase the salience of social stimuli. So for us to understand social stimuli, social interactions, there's always a rhythm to what we say, what we do, how we move. And that helps us understand when I should talk, when I should be quiet, when I should listen, which sometimes children with autism, autistic children, they miss those cues, right? Music can help them. music can come in and support them in understanding those cues. And we see that. I see that when I do the parent coaching and I ask them to, instead of tell him to jump, start singing, jump, jump, jump. Kids just catch on. They start looking more. And it's not that we are forcing eye contact. It happens spontaneously when they are starting to understand what the game is, what the social interaction is. And that's actually very cool to see. So at some point, I developed a whole conceptual framework on that, reading a whole lot of literature like the one I just referred to, and trying to understand how would music or parent coaching behave in this, and this, what are the variables that are working here? And there are many. I'm not going to go very deep into that, but let's just say that the intervention is the parent coaching. What does music do for the parent coaching? Well, I think it helps with arousal. It helps with attention. It helps with interaction, creating the rhythm of the interaction. And that supports parent outcomes. Parents are much happier doing this, more effective, more responsive. It helps with child outcomes because they are more attentive. They are more joyful. Of course, they are more able to understand the social communication. It also helps with parent-child outcomes because then children and parents are going to be more synchronized. All this was my theory, right? I was theorizing about this based on the previous literature. And then I started doing research on this. And that's what I tried to research. Now, music can also be a mediator of parental responsiveness. So we make parents more responsive with this type of interventions. There are other things that are at play, and we should always remember this as clinicians, is how the child is doing, what the child, how he's able to play matters. And we know that in autism research in general, the pre-study skills that the child is presented is going to matter in how much they learn in the process, okay? For example, I've seen children who have very little language grow a whole lot because the intervention was very impactful for them. And then children who are very verbal, where the intervention is impactful, but not quite as much because they already have language. Okay, so those things matter. Also, how the parent is doing, parental well-being. Are they depressed? Are they anxious? Are they having a lot on their plate? Are they able to accept the diagnosis of their child? That matters, how willing they are in doing the parent coaching, as I just described. And then, of course, if the parent has a lot of stressors other than the situation with their children, if they lost their job, if they are in a difficult marriage or relationship, that can get in the way of how parent coaching is going to work, right? It can interfere or it can make it better. Now, if you have a parent who's, a special educator, has a lot of skills, obviously they are going to learn quicker. Maybe, I have to say, because maybe their training is going to get in the way and they are going to be doing the things that they already know and they won't want to learn. So there are many factors. That's another reason why this intervention is difficult to research, because there are so many things. You are working with a system, not with a person or with a single skill. You're working with a system that has many variables around it. That's what makes it fascinating to me, of course, but it also makes it hard to find what is it that we need to measure that is going to be more meaningful.
Yes. And when you're talking about individuals, like between the parents or the caregivers and the clients being able to read each other and tying this into how you're saying it, music is kind of like the glue that can help them both synchronize to each other. I can't help but be curious, is thinking about this outside of the context of music, something that you integrate towards the end of transitioning and terminating a client so that individuals can, like caregivers, can communicate with their children effectively outside of the context of music? Or is that something that you've worried about because the individuals don't necessarily need a context outside of a musical stimulus?
Right. So how do we generalize, right? The thing is, okay, I haven't gotten that far in my research, I have to say. That's important. The second part is that I'm still trying to find out the best way of doing the music intervention. But you're completely right. We have to think forward and say, okay, how do we take away the music intervention and still keep the gains, right? The outcomes. Now, because the intervention, as I was saying at the beginning, the intervention is meant to be done in everyday life. There's no real reason to take it away. I mean, young children learn through music. They all do. I mean, they all do. Typically developing and with neurodivergent, they all learn through play and music. It's part of their life. That's why toddlers and preschoolers use music all the time, right? So there would not be a real reason to take it away. I also try to teach parents to listen to their child. It doesn't mean that they're going to be singing to them all the time. There are times when children say, stop, just stop already. And I ask them to stop. I also tell them, okay, they don't want a song right now. Let's stop and observe. It doesn't have to be singing all the time. So parents learn to observe and learn to use it very intentionally when it's appropriate and when it's useful. And that is something that I think we also have to keep in mind. It's not going to be everything through music. I do think that we can always keep it as a tool that we use in the right moment, and that the playfulness of it can happen anytime. That can be even if they're teenagers, right? You can be playful. It's not going to take it away. It's not going to take away from your interaction if you are affectionate and responsive and playful. It's actually going to make it better.
It sounds like for those parents too, to take into account the sensory needs of their children as well. And that really makes me think when you're talking about music as well.
Yes. And that's another reason I didn't mention it before. Thank you. That's another reason I think music works so well, because it is sensory, right? It is sensory, and it can be repetitive, and it's okay. And it can be used in many different ways, and we can alter the sensory part of it. For example, I can make it faster. I can make it slower. I can make it louder. I can make it quieter, and it would still provide some sensory stimulation. We have to be careful not to overstimulate. But that, again, that's part of the responsiveness, the adult responsiveness. And parents learn to observe and back off and take it easy. Sometimes they start blah, 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 and I'm like, whoa. Let's take a step back. Slow it down. You're giving too much. And they are going to not want it because it's sensory for sure.
I was looking at some of the other research that I have that I prepared before today's interview. And I was wondering, in terms of the caregivers that we're talking about, that you are essentially giving that parent coaching to, some of the research suggests, for instance, this one that I'm reading currently, in individuals ages 25 to 44, they're the most likely to be staying at home. And within that, they're almost 3 times as likely as women are almost 3 times as likely as men to not be working due to the childcare demands. So are those that you're working with mainly the mothers of the children, or do you have opportunities with the fathers? And what does that dynamic look like?
Oh, great question. Yes, they have been mainly moms, for sure. Sometimes fathers have been involved in some degree. But yeah, I've worked mainly with the mother, who is the main caregiver. And even though they are sometimes working full time, they are still the main caregiver. That is the nature of what's happening in many countries, in Mexico for sure, that women are taking more responsibility at home, especially during the pandemic. They get to stay at home, lose their job, and stay with a child.
Yeah. And that just ties directly into what you were speaking about earlier, of how outside stressors can definitely influence whether a parent or a caregiver is ready to accept those coaching positions, on top of everything they're already handling. Do you integrate siblings in with this approach as well?
Okay, for research purposes, no, because again, I have to keep it as clean as possible. That's the problem with research. You have to have like very delimited situations so that you can study and then integrate. Although in real sessions, in coaching sessions that have been outside of the research perspective, yes, I have included siblings, which is kind of fun, older and younger, and sometimes babies. which brings a challenge into the session, because what does the mom do when the baby's crying, or when the older child is getting bored, or how do we integrate that? That's a challenge that I have not addressed formally in my research, but that needs to be addressed for sure.
Outside of research, do you teach the same techniques in like a simplified format to the older siblings, or what does that look like with their role?
That's very interesting. I try to teach the parent to make a game, for example, to include the other sibling in the game. If they are co-creating a game with, I don't know, a ball, and they are singing to the bouncing, for example, let the younger child participate and bounce too. If they are creating a song around where they are, moving and playing, incorporate integrate the child, whatever the age, and help them play. Allow them to take turns. Allow them to take turns with a toy if they are playing with a toy. So those kind of things. But I mainly work with the parent, because one important principle of this model too is that you want to not take away authority from the parent. You want to empower the parent to stay in their role within the family. So I gave suggestions directly to the parent so that they can decide how to handle their children.
Wonderful. Thank you for explaining that so thoroughly. I'm having so many, personally, I'm having so many connections with this, and not just autism, but also in-home pediatrics. This seems to just be right at the same relevance to that. Maybe it's because I'm also working with children.
Absolutely. And if you read, for example, the literature of Dr. Helen Schumark, who works in pediatrics, we have a lot of similar principles. I love her work, by the way, and she gives a lot of nice principles of how to address the parent, how to become a co-creator of the therapy with the parent and give them their place within the family. You don't want to take that away, especially not when they are so vulnerable. The parents are feeling so vulnerable and so impotent in a situation that they can't control. You want to give all the power back that you can.
It's always great in those wild situations, or situations that are out of hand, to get some sense of power, especially during COVID, when not only are you losing power in your jobs or with figuring out how to take care of your kids, but also just overarching, there's a systemic loss of power and loss of independence. So I can only imagine the effects would be amplified in that type of situation. Now, we've talked a lot about the theory behind your research. Is there any other parts of your research that we haven't touched on as much that you would like to address with everybody?
Well, I would invite them to read it. That's always the best thing to do with research. Go and read it, because I can talk about it, but it's better if you read the whole thing. I know it's hard to read research, but it's worth it, because there are times that it's hard to express all that we need to express. And then you can see the results for yourselves. And then you can see what it looks like. I have to say, most of my results are not definitive. And it's not like, oh, music is just so much better than play sessions. No, both play sessions and music sessions are good. For some people, it's better. Music is better. For some people, play sessions are better. For some skills, music is better than for other skills. So it's a complex picture. It's not a black and white kind of thing. So it's good to read that literature. Some of that has been published in Music Therapy Perspectives. There's this study called Feasibility of Parent Coaching of Music Interventions for Children with ASD. Now, be attentive, because there's another one coming up in the Journal of Music Therapy. It's Improving a Parent Coaching Model of Music Interventions for Young Autistic Children. It's the follow-up, it's the sequel of that first one that I mentioned. And that should be out in a month or something. And just remember that when we as clinicians read research, we have still to be mindful that was a specific situation, maybe with a small sample size, whatever. We have to take the principles, understand what the authors were trying to do, and then bring it to the clinical practice in a very cautious way and in a very, applying the differences that should be considered when you're working with a very specific family. I think there are some takeaways that we can share. May I?
Absolutely.
So, for example, the takeaways for me regarding parent coaching in general is that we have to use adult learning principles. That's a pretty important one. For me, when I was trained in parent coaching, I was like, wow, that's a big one. These are co-creators of the therapy, right? We have to identify the critical aspects of the intervention that need to be shared with the parent. We also have to consider motivation, fatigue, and stress when planning the coaching. And we have to consider, or at least that's my bias, but I do think that parent coaching is an advanced practice. Get some practice yourself, work with the children, understand how they learn and all that, and then try to teach an adult how to work with them. And then regarding the music intervention, as I said, I use both pre-composed music and also improvisatory music. So inventing little songs that narrate or accompany what the child is doing is a great way of supporting the child and validating whatever they are doing. Follow their interest and embed the music in everyday routines. And once the music routine is established, then you have to wait for the child to do something. It's not just singing the song at him. It's having a conversation with the song, right? And keeping it fun and interesting.
Well, thank you for summarizing those for everyone. And something to challenge our listeners with is maybe read one of those articles and read all of them if you'd like, and try and find your individual takeaways as well, of how you can integrate those into your practice, and maybe start small and then grow it as you continue. You don't have to do everything at once, but it's the idea of working towards growth.
Exactly. And know that this is not a static process. I mean, I am researching this. I am learning every time I do it. We have a lot of things to learn still of how to do it better. And this virtual parent coaching is just starting. We are all like thrown into the game and we have too much to learn. So keep reading, keep going to conferences so that you hear the latest advances in this, and just keep talking to people.
Yes, keep the conversation going. Where can individuals find you if they have any additional questions or if they want to get in contact?
Sure, I'll share my email. My email is just my name, Eugenia, EUGENIA .Hernandez. That's HERNANDEZ .Ruiz, RUIZ @ASU.edu. That's my email at ASU. You can also look it online if you want, or I know Brian is going to share it. So absolutely, please contact me if you need to.
Yes, and all that information will be in the show notes, so you can always click more information. And the articles that we have referenced today will also be there as well. Make sure to tune in to the next episode of Voices of Music Therapy, or you can also listen to some of the amazing guests that we have. I know you referenced Dr. Locascio several times, and that was in our previous episode, so you can always listen to her as well. And I want to thank you so much for coming onto the show and really sharing your passions with the music therapy community and the community at large.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this.
If you'd like to see today's guest or learn more about the show, check us out on Facebook or Instagram at Voices of Music Therapy, or on Twitter at VOMT Podcast. If you have any questions, or if you know any innovative music therapist and would like to recommend them for the show, you can email us at voicesofmusictherapy@gmail.com.